Okay, hello. Michael Tracy here. The UK general election, which was called by Theresa May in not so long ago. When exactly did she call the election? Was it in early May?
She called it, I think it was around the 18th of
18th of April.
April.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, she'd said repeatedly since she took the leadership, I think she's on the record about 6 or 7 different times saying, no, not absolutely not calling a general election until 2020. We need stability. We've got Brexit negotiations to deal with. Never going to be an election. And then, oh, I'm calling a snap election because I think she felt she was so far ahead in the polls. It was basically a walk in the park. She wouldn't even have to campaign. She could sit there quietly, sipping champagne in Downing Street while our fairly conservative mainstream media in the UK did her job for her, and just kind of walked into number 10 on the 9th of June again as Prime Minister. And that has not quite panned out.
Yeah, and then, I mean, we're getting. First of all, I should introduce you, Kerry-anne Mendoza. Can you just state your name and title so people are aware?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Kerry-anne Mendoza. I'm editor-in-chief of a new media. Sorry, I'm Kerry-anne Mendoza. I'm editor-in-chief and co-founder of the Canary, which is an independent news outlet in the UK. We started in late 2015, and we literally had £500 that we put in ourselves. No money, no connections, and we've actually grown into one of the biggest websites in the UK now. And we've just overtaken Rupert Murdoch's The Times in the Alexa web ranking. So it's a really exciting time for us and our peers in new media as well. You've got Evolve Politics and Another Angry Voice and Wings Over Scotland and many others who are also breaking through in this period of time, really creating a space for a proper progressive platform, which has been really entirely absent from our mainstream press, at least for a decade.
I think I first became aware of the Canary because some New Statesman editors were complaining about it. I think this was probably during either the first or second leadership campaign that Corbyn won. But either way, there was definitely an instinctive sort of aversion to whatever they felt the Canary represented on the part of those editors. And it's interesting because the New Statesman obviously is Labour affiliated, but they've been very hostile toward Corbyn from the outset.
Mm. Absolutely. I mean, the New Statesman is really kind of a core part of the sort of Tony Blair style of kind of neoliberal Labour, which is all about saying, you can have a softly capitalism, corporatism is great. It doesn't matter if we've got private profiteers delivering NHS services for twice the price. All of that stuff doesn't matter, and you all need to get on board. And they've got into quite a dangerous sort of dialogue. Well, it's not a dialogue, it's a monologue at the moment, which is saying, Breitbart is outright, and the Canary and other new media are out left, as if these two things are equivalent to each other. When actually, what you've got is a resurgent far right happening in places like Breitbart and beyond, of people who are on a daily basis pumping out racist, bigoted, sexist, anti-Semitic content. And then you've got a voice on the left like the Canary and others who are challenging that. That doesn't make them equivalent. It's sort of as absurd as almost seeing a house on fire, a arsonist running out and a firefighter running in and saying, look, that there's an out arsonist, that firefighter is an out arsonist. It's just absurd. One is creating a danger,
Yeah.
and the other is attempting to call it out.
I think the only sense in which they're equivalent is that the media landscape now allows for a wider breadth of ideological affinities to be put on display and to get their message out really forcefully and to gain a following. And I think that is inherently a threat to the more establishmentarian outlets. So they kind of lapse into this lazy grouping tactic. So as if you're somehow inherently associated with people who you share no ideological predilection with.
I think you're absolutely right. I think what they're doing is turning what for them is a commercial threat. They're being challenged commercially right now by these new outlets, and they're trying to whip up a moral panic in order to defend themselves and defend their own bottom lines, basically, which I think is an incredibly cynical use of their platform. I think what they could be doing right now is advancing progressive arguments and taking the fight to the likes of Breitbart and others, and our own press. I mean, you don't have to look to Breitbart in this country to find, incitement to hate speech and violence. We have Murdoch tabloids like The Sun, tabloids like the Daily Mail and the Daily Star, the Daily Express, which have readerships of millions of people a day, who are just pumping out the most divisive, hateful rhetoric against the most vulnerable and marginalised communities that Britain has. And the mainstream press has manifestly failed to call that out. So we are. And it's absolutely brilliant to see what's happened in the last 18 months, 2 years, of actually people saying, we're just not buying this anymore. We're just not buying it. We're going another way. We want to share more. We want to be kinder, more compassionate, more inclusive. We want to invest in each other and our future. And to see that happening in Britain, it's kind of reminding us of what it felt like, almost like my grandparents' generation, who came back from World War II and built the welfare state. They built the NHS, they built a national education system, they built this incredible housing program. Really the kind of welfare state that my parents benefited from, that I benefited from, but that within my lifetime has been torn apart and sold off. And now you've got this kind of hunger and appetite again in our generation to say, no, this is our time. Let's claim it back. Let's rebuild it, and let's leave a legacy we can be proud of, like our grandparents did before us.
Interestingly, the ascendance of Corbyn seems to have coincided with this shift toward alternative media sources, or at least Corbyn supporters would routinely state that they are disillusioned with how the media tends to portray him, or at least they did in the past. There seems to have been a shift recently. But in the past, especially during the leadership elections, there was this idea that the media establishment was condescending toward Corbyn supporters, either portraying them as sort of, wild-eyed left loonies or just naive, which pretty remarkably echoes how the Bernie Sanders supporters were treated in the media in the U.S. with some exceptions. For example, Bernie Sanders actually did have the support of, say, maybe the rough equivalent of the New Statesman in the U.S. would be The Nation magazine, and Bernie Sanders was supported by The Nation magazine pretty unabashedly. Yeah, so that's not a totally neat parallel. But I'm wondering if
you're right. There is some crossover.
Is that a trend that is there like a synergy there? Is that a trend that you've observed?
Absolutely, and I think you can almost take Corbyn out of it. I think that upset was there before. What you have essentially in UK media, and I'm sure it's partially true for the US as well, is that you essentially have a media and political class that is almost one and the same. So our journalists, are kind of largely white, largely middle class. They went to the same kind of 6 universities. They graduated 6 inches to the left or the right of each other politically. And this gap between them, it forms this minuscule arena in which all of the media debate about politics, economics, current affairs, the kind of world we can and want to build together happens. So it's this tiny little window. And then you have all of this other stuff, all of these other ideas, all of these other life journeys and experiences that are happening outside of that bubble in Westminster that are simply not represented. And that's really hit crisis point with the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, because you had people outside that bubble saying, thank goodness, like someone finally who's in leader of a mainstream political party is actually talking to us, is actually putting his finger on our problems. We can't afford our rent, we can't afford a mortgage, the hospital down the street's closed down, I can't get my kids into a decent school. There's 1.2 million food parcels were handed out in Britain last year. People are literally too poor to eat in large places of our country, and no one was addressing it. And then Jeremy Corbyn won by a landslide, when the whole political establishment basically viewed his nomination as a joke and was saying, he had bets of 200 to 1 that he was going to win that leadership contest, and he won it by a landslide. Then they held a coup to try and get rid of him, which triggered another leadership election, which he won by an even greater landslide. So at this point, they're really tearing their hair out. And I think, by the time it came to the election, they thought they had it. He was all but dead in the water politically. This has not been. This is not as if the media just haven't covered Jeremy Corbyn or have covered him unsympathetically. This has been an relentless character assassination of him that has taken place over the last 18 months. And not just him, but anyone who put their head above the parapet to say they supported him. We had a Labour donor given a full page in the Daily Mail to call Corbyn supporters Nazi stormtroopers. Just the most horrific, accusations being levelled at people. These are just voters who would quite like to vote for someone who says we should share more. Jeremy Corbyn, a winner of the Gandhi Prize in 2013 for his efforts of peacemaking over a 30-year, parliamentary career, and you've got the front page of newspapers saying he's a terrorist-loving communist. It's really just, you cannot even imagine the level of abuse he's taken. But throughout that, he has been packing in the crowds. His message has been resonating with people across the country. And throughout the course of this election, even the people that were on the fence, maybe getting a little bit affected by this relentless bashing in the media, are going, hang on, when they're seeing him at the debates and seeing him around in their towns, they're saying, this isn't the guy that's been described to me. I quite like this guy. It's like, this is just seems like a decent man who's speaking to my issues, and his policies are fully costed, and they're promising a significantly better country than the one we've currently got in the next 5 years. So it's an exciting time.
I think on the point of this media culture, which for some reason was structurally hostile toward Corbyn, I think the way that you describe it in the UK is interesting. I think there are aspects of it that are applicable to the US, but I think at the same time the UK environment is even more incestuous and cloistered.
Yeah.
There are elements of that in how the American media functions, but it's so much more dispersed that there are much more avenues for entry, and it's much harder to keep it a cloistered environment, I would say, aside from the most rarefied circles. But that's sort of an ancillary point. One thing that I've been curious about, and I would have read about if American politics wasn't so blindsiding every single day, but there was this act of Parliament passed in 2011, the Fixed Terms Parliament Act, correct? Yep. Which was supposed to standardize the election process in the UK, so that it happened on a fixed term every 5 years. And people almost viewed the timing of elections as almost a settled issue and off the table outside the hands of the Prime Minister. But it seems like Theresa May had no problem whatsoever, just totally flouting that piece that act. So what happened there mechanically? I just don't understand. Was that just a system failure or something? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think because David Cameron resigned, it gave us the potential to have a new election, because we were saying, well, Theresa May doesn't have a mandate, So originally, many of us were calling for, the time of the Brexit referendum. We were saying we can't just have a referendum. We need to have a general election within 6 months of that referendum. So the parties are saying this is how we will remain in Europe or Brexit. And you can vote for us in a general election after the referendum to make sure that, the referendum answers, if, and the general election would answer how. So this is if we leave the EU or if we remain, and then you pick a party that will deliver the type of Brexit or the type of remain that you want to see. And we didn't get that. So what we had instead was a whole bunch of different campaign groups to the Brexit referendum that could say whatever the hell they liked in the hopes of winning the vote, which ended up being the Brexit vote. So we're leaving the European Union without a plan. Literally, there is no plan. Theresa May does not have a plan. The EU has a plan. They have all of the negotiators. They've developed their red lines. And we're at sea, really, in this country, wondering what our future is going to look like. So that's that. But remember, in terms of electoral integrity, the Conservative Party is in hot water well beyond fixed-term parliaments on that right now. We just had an unprecedented event, which you may have seen about, which is essentially the issue of election expenses fraud that took place by the Conservative Party during the 2015 general election that may well have impacted the outcome. They only won a majority of 12. This was a really narrow victory for the Conservatives and entirely unexpected. They were expected to be defeated.
And one of those seats actually led to the defeat of Nigel Farage, right? He was contesting one of those seats that the Tory who won ended up being accused of, financial improprieties. It
did. Well, it was actually across 20 seats that the election fraud was alleged to have happened, and our kind of regulator of elections, the Electoral Commission, actually handed down an unprecedented fine. It's the highest fine they can give, which is still pennies to the Conservative Party, but it was £70,000. And our Crown Prosecution Service is now prosecuting. It's charged a sitting Conservative, well, not sitting technically now because we're in a state of flux ahead of the election, but an MP who is trying to become the Conservative MP again in this election, and he's been charged.
So this is sort of an offshoot or variation on the expenses scandal from, when was that, 2009 or so, which was unprecedented at the time. So this is too. So that expenses scandal was basically about MPs get their salary and they get expenses, and they were just getting crazy. So they were flipping homes so you could get expenses to cover a mortgage on one home. So they were basically kind of getting really expensive homes in their constituency, and flipping their mortgage from their home mortgage to their constituency so they could personally benefit financially from the expenses. I have one Conservative MP who literally put a duck pond in his note and put it on expenses paid for by the taxpayer. Our welfare secretary, the guy who has ripped apart the welfare state in this country, you literally have 10,600 sick and disabled people died the first year of the Conservative government in 2010, going through a work capability assessment. And around 1,500 of those had been assessed as fit for work and subsequently died, having had their benefits removed. And the guy who was making those decisions was charging expenses of £39 for his own breakfast. Their welfare. I just have to point out the contrast between what is viewed as shocking financial impropriety in the UK with regard to electioneering versus what is viewed as shocking impropriety in the US with regard to electioneering, just because we now have basically, the current president has a global real estate empire, which basically redounds to his political benefit, and there's nothing legally anybody can do about it. And even the Democratic nominee last year, Hillary Clinton, had a global corporatized foundation, which people use basically as a proxy to exert political influence over her and her coterie of supporters. So, this, and then while in the meantime, what's shocking in the UK is a duck pond and breakfast.
And you know what? That, I think, is something that we can be proud of. One of the things that we have done really successfully in the UK is, as far as possible, take money out of politics. But it happens in a different way here. So, we have essentially a revolving door between our regulators, think people like the Financial Services Authority, who oversee the city, the Electoral Commission that overlook our electoral processes, our corporate world, our banks, our City of London, our sort of financial services heart, and our politics. And there is this revolving door, not unlike the States, but it's just kind of quieter. So, we had, take the new Labour government, you had a chap called John Reid, who was Home Secretary for a number of years, under Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, that period of time. On his watch, he managed to privatise a whole bunch of the Ministry of Justice to a company called G4S, which are a global security company. You might have heard of them in the United States as well. And what happens when he leaves office? He becomes an executive director of G4S. So it's, while you're in government, set yourself up in an executive directorship. You leave politics when you're kicked out, and you go and benefit from the decisions that you made financially. And that is all over our political system. So essentially, you have a corporatist system where politicians are making political decisions that they're saying are, an economic necessity, which is only true in the sense that it's essential for their personal financial situation because they can guarantee themselves lucrative positions when they leave politics. And that's pretty sickening. And that's something that I think is starting to become much higher profile now that the new media is reporting on it more. It's, the established media hasn't done a great job of reporting on it because, again, they're the same groups of people, exemplified, I think, by the fact that our former Chancellor, George Osborne, is now the editor of the London Evening Standard. So he's literally moved directly from being, in politics, straight into the media to prop up his friends back at the Conservative Party.
Well, Boris Johnson didn't even bother moving between the two worlds. He just fused them, right? He was a columnist for the Telegraph while he was, or was it the Spectator while he was the mayor of London.
Completely, and actually interesting.
Was it the Telegraph or the Times?
Did try to do the same.
Was it the Telegraph or the Times? I'm thinking Telegraph, but I could be wrong.
Boris has done the Spectator and the Telegraph. I don't think it was the Times. It might have been the Times. Yeah. But and George Osborne did actually try to do the same. Right. So he'd obviously been booted out of his job as Chancellor, but he was still a sitting MP. And he had no intention of giving up that job whatsoever until there was a massive outcry. And then he said, "Oh, fine."
Here's another interesting cultural contrast, though, is like as sort of insidious as like the Boris Johnson or George Osborne arrangement is, it at least kind of illustrates that how in the U.S. there's in the UK there's always been a different kind of attitude toward this so-called media objectivity ethos than there has been in the U.S., which until very recently very much prized this notion that a journalist should at least be ostensibly separate from politics, shouldn't engage in anything remotely close to campaigning or electioneering or that kind of thing. Whereas in the UK, it's pretty much, it's not seen as odd in the slightest. And in fact, it's seen as expected. I think the Trump era has caused a sort of realignment of attitudes toward that in the U.S. But historically, or at least in recent history, that's sort of been an interesting dichotomy between the two sort of media political cultures.
Absolutely. I mean, part of what tends to happen here, so you tend to have the real movement between the press and politics is the directors of strategy. So you had Alistair Campbell under Tony Blair, who's, long-term journalist, media editor, all that sort of stuff, straight into Downing Street. Then you had, the Sun's Andy Coulson move from the Murdoch empire into the heart of Downing Street with David Cameron. And then obviously the hacking scandal broke and that ended his career at that period of time and put him in jail for a limited period of time. But that continues to happen. So that relationship is there. And I find it really interesting when people sort of freaked out when Steve Bannon ended up joining Trump in the White House. But that's what's been happening in the UK for decades, is essentially the sort of the paper that backs, the sort of the leadership hardest generally ends up being offered the job of chief strategist to the government once the election is over. So that's kind of how that happens.
And to be fair, there is some of that. I mean, the job of the press secretary is maybe a little anomalous in how this works. But for example, Obama had a correspondent for Time magazine serve as his press secretary for a while.
Yes,
Jay Carney.
Absolutely standard.
George W. Bush had Tony Snow, who was a Fox News personality. So there's definitely a history of it, even going back to JFK. But
completely. That's
sort of a very narrow sliver of the media political culture, whereas I think in the UK it's a little more broad. That ethos is a little more broad based.
Yeah, well, I guess as long as you're only arguing within the tent.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing. I mean, our journalists are pretty interchangeable too. They're kind of there's no real kind of diversity in terms of our media output. So it's fairly common for journalists to move from what you would consider the right of the UK press to the the left, which doesn't exist, but let's say the liberal side of the UK press, barely changing a word that they're writing. They're all kind of singing from the same hymn sheet the majority of the time. You can really barely put a cigarette paper.
I love that phrase, by the way, singing from the same hymn sheet.
It really is. And so I think, and that's part of the frustration that you have, is that, that limits the conversation. And where that caused a lot of damage actually was in the wake of the financial crisis in 2007-8. Because for a moment there, everyone went, oh my God, the system doesn't work. Look what the system just did. These banks, unregulated, allowed to, roll out casino banking with collateral debt obligations and credit. We all know the story, and basically crashed the world economy. And without any consultation, our government bailed out those banks to a fantastic tune of money, which created a national debt, which created a budget deficit. That's how that deficit happened. And then the Conservative government that followed and the entire press completely kind of bought into this idea that actually the problem wasn't neoliberalism. It was like not enough neoliberalism. We've overspent on too many nurses and too many teachers and, too many people on job seekers allowance, and it just the conversation completely morphed. And that gave great succor to the right, because they could say, see, we told you, when you let in all these immigrants, when you let all these people come here for, to nick our benefits and nick our health service, look, they've destroyed the economy. And what we need is to, let business boom and stop, giving all this money to scroungers, and then we'll have a fantastic economy. Of course, what's happened in reality is that all of the policies that have come since have torn apart the UK economy. So we'd actually here now, we don't have a UK economy. We don't have one economy. We have regional economies. We have 12 regional economies, effectively. And there are only 2 of those that are at least as well off or richer than they were 10 years ago at the time of the financial crisis. And they will be unsurprising to you. They are London and the South East. Every other region of the UK is poorer than it was in 2007, and actually several of them are in outright depression.
Right, and there's an amazing parallel there with the US as well. If you look, there have been studies and there have been basically theses floated to explain why the Midwest went dramatically for Trump. I mean, he won most of the states there narrowly, but that there was a shift that profound was really a shock to most commentators, and part of the reason why is that the unemployment is relatively higher in those states, in those areas, and just the economic activity that they're organized around has progressed at a much slower or even flat rate than, say, other areas. So if you look at the Washington D.C. metro area, for example, which is very prosperous. It's like, this imperial capital where you get outflows of federal provision and government contracts and defense and so forth. I mean, that area is very, very prosperous and is continually, even now, being developed. And Trump did not do well at all in that region. So that's a pretty easily explicable economic kind of lens through which to view American politics, or at least a portion of it, and I think there's something similar in the UK going on, or at least that was the way that Brexit, or the Brexit vote was interpreted, I think, with some legitimacy.
Absolutely. I mean, the Brexit vote was a real kind of an FU notice to kind of this medium political class that I'm referring to. A lot of people really miffed. And just saying, you've ignored us for too long. We have a chance to give you a bit of a slap, and we're going to do it. We're going to take that chance. I mean, the problem is, I think they may have overswung and hit themselves back in the face, but nevertheless, the anger was there. What is so much more exciting about this election versus the Brexit vote is that the competing ideas are really clear. The competing ideas were not clear in Brexit, because nobody really knew what everyone meant by Brexit one person's Brexit was totally different from another person's, and ditto Remain, actually. Nobody was really clear on what we were campaigning for or against. In this election, it's very clear. The Conservative manifesto is unlike almost any document you've ever seen. If you haven't read it, it's worth a read, just for the sheer gall of the thing. She's swung at every possible demographic she could have swung at. She's hitting the elderly voters with withdrawing support for their energy bills and literally a dementia tax to come after people's houses to pay for their social care rather than fund it through the state, which we currently do. She's come after young people, no promises on tuition fees or anything, versus the sort of the Corbynist kind of movement, which is saying, okay, we're unashamedly socialist. This is a democratic socialist manifesto to invest in people and trade, individuals and communities for the future over the long term. This is really a night and day choice at the ballot box, which, it hasn't happened in the UK for 40 years.
Something,
and I don't think it's happened in the US for that long.
So something weird that I've noticed is if you look at the conservative press, they are complaining about the Conservative manifesto as being a sop somehow to, even labor priorities. There was a big column in The Spectator complaining that Theresa May has adopted some of Ed Miliband's rhetoric and policies, like raising the minimum wage even higher than Miliband had proposed, and a cap on energy, and even some skepticism of the utility of free markets. So I don't know what is that? Is that grounded in anything, you think?
No, well, basically May had a problem, which was she came into power and said, I'm not like David Cameron. I'm not like George Osborne. I'm a vicar's daughter and I'm a one nation conservative and I'm going to build a country that works for everyone. So there was this hope, essentially, that her premiership, because actually there have been a lot of conservatives who are really done with austerity. You do have one nation conservatives in our country who are pro-investment, who are pro-welfare state. And they've been looking at this kind of short-termist, carpetbagger kind of government system that we've had the last few years, and they've become really disenchanted with it. And so I think Theresa May was trying to position herself as like this fresh candidate that was in this for the long haul. She wasn't just going to flit in and flit out and make as much profit as possible. She was going to try and, bring back the trickle-down effect and all that, kind of stuff. And she's ended up doing the worst of both worlds, because she's kind of floated this idea of this energy cap, which was nowhere near what Ed Miliband was proposing at the time anyway, so it didn't convince anyone who wanted the energy cap, but it really angered, kind of her backers in the six big energy companies we have, for in any way validating the argument that they're essentially using a monopoly to just relentlessly inflate energy prices. So she lost there. And then so she tries to look tough and tries to go back to being this kind of the nasty party and walking around telling people, we can't have this stuff because there's no magic money tree.
She takes a U-turn, that's the term. Then,
oh my God, it's not even a U-turn. We're calling it an O-turn now, because she's just spinning. At least in a U-turn, you hit a new direction, you crack on. She's just spinning on her, on the same axis. So it's been hugely embarrassing, this whole process. I think she's terminally wounded, actually, from this election process. I can't, whatever the result, bar a miracle landslide for her on June the 8th, which is looking ever less likely. The Conservative Party is known for swift and very effective coups against leaders that they find dissatisfying. They even took down Margaret Thatcher, and that lady was not for turning. And I would safely predict that May is on the outs in terms of her leadership of the party. You can see Conservatives starting to break ranks now. Some of the Conservative press being fairly vocal about some of the mistakes that she's made. I don't know how it would land in the US. Can you imagine a presidential candidate refusing to participate in debates ahead of your election? This happened here. Theresa May literally said, I'm not doing it. and her whole campaign was on strong and stable leadership, and she refused to defend her own policies at a leadership debate.
And she called the election. I mean, she's the one who initiated the process, which would demand a debate that be had, which is, I mean, and she did appear on the Question Time special, back to back with Corbyn, and I think there's a Jeremy Paxman thing, but it's not like a face-to-face debate where she can be directly challenged.
Yeah, absolutely. And her whole campaign has been like this. I mean, we've been calling her Kim Jong-may on the campaign trail with reference to the leader of North Korea, because her whole campaign has consisted of turning up at empty factories, walking around them and addressing like 12 Tory party staff outside. And it's just been horrific. I mean, just how not to run an election campaign. And then you've contrasted that with what's happened with Corbyn. I mean, even just yesterday, he was addressing, thousands upon thousands of people turned out to see him in the rain in Gateshead, which is one of our northern towns. He's been addressing football, packed crowds in football stadiums. Pop stars have had him on stage at their concerts saying, "Vote Jeremy." We've even got grime for Corbyn, where a sort of a really popular form of music here at the moment is grime. Really popular in that kind of 18 to 24-year-olds, which is a constituency we need to get voting in this general election. There's like a hashtag called Grime for Corbyn. We've got literally the leaders of the grime community coming out. I mean, like, vote for Jeremy Corbyn. It's just, honestly, it's unprecedented. There really has not been a politician in this country in my life that has had this kind of reaction from across the age spectrum, across class, across ethnic and religious boundaries. There's talk as well of like potentially there being a really higher than normal black vote in this election because of the impact that Jeremy's had in that community over his whole career too. So it really feels like there's a potential at this election to deliver a serious upset to the establishment. And so, every paper came out against him. Every pundit came out against him. Everyone said this was a disaster for the Labour Party. And it currently looks like he's going to do better than the party did in 2015 and potentially 2010. So we're all crossing our fingers and working very, very hard in the final days.
Yeah, here's what The Spectator said of Theresa May's campaign. Quote, "This is the worst Tory election campaign ever. And Theresa May has the warmth, wit, and oratorical ability of a fridge freezer." It's interesting because it wasn't a given that Theresa May would even win the Conservative leadership contest. It only came about because of a weird set of machinations between Johnson, Michael Gove, and others, and just the discombobulation that stemmed from the Brexit vote. So it's not as if like she was completely beloved, but really
she was crowned. Yeah. She was crowned. I mean, there was clearly some serious manoeuvring going on backstage. There was no public input into who was going to be, or member input into who was going to be leader of the Conservative Party. But it is important to remember that since she became leader, she's had almost universally positive press. So what's happened to her in these last few weeks, this was not predicted. She was going into this as, massively, really high approval ratings for her personally, which meant the whole Conservative campaign was geared just around her. It was around Theresa May versus Jeremy Corbyn. Who do you want as Prime Minister? And they almost said it like laughing, do you want this terrorist-loving communist or Theresa May? And they kind of tried to make her this kind of new Margaret Thatcher. This kind of strong woman who's going to go in, no nonsense, going to tell Brussels where to stick it, get the best deal for Britain, and be tough at home, tough abroad. And I think several factors have actually undermined that. And actually a very big one is coming from the US. Her relationship with Donald Trump has really played against her at home, because there is outrage at Donald Trump in Britain right now. This is a pretty liberal country. And to see the sorts of stuff that he said and won an election on, was went down like a political earthquake in the United Kingdom. We've been horrified. I mean, we're on about, not letting him have a state visit. There's been a real uproar about him even being granted the dignity of a state visit to the UK versus just a visit where he walks into Downing Street. So then you have two big things happen in the wake of the shock of that election, when, you know, around the world, you know, liberals and progressives were saying, this is outrageous that this man has taken the presidency of the United States. This is a bad thing for America, a bad thing for the world. And Theresa May's holding his hand, you know, walking around the White House, saying these beautiful things about him, which just absolutely did not represent Britain's position. It went well beyond diplomacy into flattery. And then right after that, you have Angela Merkel's visit from Germany. And, you know, people essentially, I know the press over your way too, calling Angela Merkel now the leader of the free world, effectively. You know, she is now the leader of the free world. So there was that. And then recently you had the Paris Agreement, you know, the climate agreement, which Donald Trump is attempting to declared unilaterally that he's going to pull the United States out of. Global disagreement, you know, even from the likes of China and others that you would, you know, maybe expect to kind of benefit from that and pull out themselves, saying no. And the, you know, Trump's position being condemned in the strongest terms, you know, from leaders across the world, and even Bill de Blasio, you know, he got a New York mayor. And what, you know, Theresa May is asked yesterday 5 times by the press to provide some criticism of that. Nothing. You know, she came out and said, oh, we've had a phone call. I expressed a bit of disappointment. Just not good enough. And then we have, you know, Trump attacking the mayor of London. You know, we have elected for the first time in history a Muslim mayor of London. He's a Labour Party mayor of London. And we have, you know, the likes of Breitbart and Gateway Pundit, you know, openly denouncing him as somehow sympathetic to the terrorists because he's a Muslim. Trump completely misquoting him on Twitter as if he's saying we've got nothing to worry about from terrorism, which was just unconscionable. And again, Theresa May asked several times over, don't you want to stand up for the London Med? Do you feel that you should criticise Mr. Trump for his, you know, comments? Crickets. Nothing coming from her at all. You know, meanwhile, you've got political leaders within the United States, you know, who are, you know, calling out their own president for behaving this way on the world stage, while our own prime minister is so weak and incapable at this point. She can't even stand up for our own mayor of London in the wake of a terror attack. So all these kind of interactions with Trump have also really damaged her at home in the run up to this election, because we want, you know, we've got an ocean between us that's no longer sufficient in terms of the political distance required for us and Donald Trump right now.
I just wonder if May maybe calculates that she can exert, I mean, this would be her own reckoning. Maybe she could exert positive influence on Trump by being relatively deferential and diplomatic with him. Obviously, Trump has a very demonstrable propensity to get involved in public feuds with people. So maybe she views it as pretty incumbent on her to try to avoid that. It's just hard to know, like, what if she would go around denouncing him, would that actually be of any real political benefit to her? I don't know.
It really would. It really would, because, you know, I mean, that isn't the position Theresa May's in. So our biggest trading partner is not the United States, it's Europe. Right. That is by far and away our biggest trading partner. Those are the people that we need to have the relationships with. They're not only trading partner in terms of imports and exports, but a lot of our companies are based in multiple European countries at the same time. So not having tariff barriers, you know, the free movement of people is really important, because we're building this stuff together effectively. Equally, at the same time, you have Donald Trump's America First policy. Donald Trump is reaching out to make generous trade deals with Britain. You know, Theresa May came back to Britain with her tail between her legs after that first meeting with Donald Trump. You know, she went out promising, I'm going to come back with a pioneering trade deal with the United States, you know, because, you know, it seemed like Europe was being hostile to him, so we're going to benefit. And that isn't Trump's style at all. Trump isn't looking to benefit Theresa May. Trump is looking to benefit Donald Trump and only Donald Trump. and so it's just absurd to think that she would somehow create a sort of relationship with Trump that would create some economic miracle. It's absolutely not on the cards. Meanwhile, Europe actually can do us quite some damage. We can do Europe some damage in return. So there's a real need actually for us to be moving closer there and standing in unity. And Theresa May is only pulling us away. You know, even with there was a joint statement, again unprecedented joint statement by the leaders of France, Italy, Germany, criticising Donald Trump's decision, and they asked Theresa May to sign it, and she said no. You know, so it's really hugely embarrassing here, because there's no two ways about it. Donald Trump is not going to be holding a brolly over Theresa May's head when the rain comes.
Yeah, and there's sort of a paradox there for May, right? Because she is not really viewed by the populist right as a tribune of their interests. She's a concession on their part, or she's a compromise for them. She's not somebody who comes out of the stalwartly populist right? She was for Remain in the referendum campaign, and yet she has to take steps that, at least by appearances, put her somewhat in league with the populists, right? Such as, you know, being maybe overly cordial with Trump. But there's no kind of like happy medium there. She's sort of treading a weirdly delineated line.
Absolutely, and I mean that line with the right as well is that the right don't want to be dominated by anybody. So like the same people who kind of voted for UKIP and voted for Brexit because they didn't want to be dominated by the EU are the same people, some of them, who actually protested against the Iraq War because they didn't want to be dominated by an American government in terms of foreign policy. So I think if May have incorrectly kind of judged that pool of people and thought, oh, they hate Europe so much, you know, if I kind of send these positive signals to the States, they're all going to come with me. And actually they didn't, because they see actually right now, you know, a far greater threat in real terms, you know, from a kind of renegade president in terms of Donald Trump than anything else. And, you know, there is a kind of a style of patriotism in that community, which is not hugely dissimilar to the patriotism in the Donald Trump voter community. So imagine how they would react if there was a terror attack on UK soil and a London mayor, or, you know, Theresa May said of the mayor of that town, you know, what a wimp. You know, you can imagine how those kind of Trump supporters, you know, would be. You'd be like, how dare you attack the United States when we're, you know, already walking wounded. You know, that's how that went down.
You know, it's funny because those people, I mean, maybe those of them that are very engaged in, you know, everyday news cycle would take umbrage with that and be, you know, made aware of it. But for the most part, it wouldn't even register. They wouldn't even know who Theresa May is. I mean, she's just not a dominant personality, which is so funny because Trump absolutely is one of the most dominant personalities that the world has probably ever seen at this point. I mean, I don't think anybody goes a day without thinking of Trump, and it's pretty oppressive just psychologically that people have to be constantly, you know, assessing the wild proclivities of this person day in and day out.
Well, absolutely. I was actually writing in the US for several years, and I was actually reporting the kind of primaries and the whole election. I ended up coming back to the UK just after all of that stuff. And I can remember just that whole process of the election just being so demoralizing as a writer, because it's kind of like, do I have to write another thing about Trump?
Yeah, it never ends. I mean, I can't tell you how many like reporters and commentators I spoke to who basically voiced the exact same thing in so many words. But you almost had to, because the editors would demand it, because it would inevitably increase traffic, right? I mean, it was just a guaranteed boon in terms of seeking attention. I mean, it is a legitimate phenomenon that needed to be analyzed, but at the same time, it's just a total overabundance of this nonstop frenzy that becomes fatiguing to the point that people can barely even take a day, for example, and talk about the really interesting UK election, because they're just so hopelessly immersed in this nonstop outrage cycle, and it's almost numbing.
I think it was interesting. We actually had Bernie Sanders over here the other day. He was speaking in London, and I think it's difficult because you can't really. I mean, obviously, Corbyn is the UK's Bernie Sanders, but they're not equivalent, and both men have admitted as much. Particularly if you look around their Middle East policy, very, very different in terms of what would happen with regards to Israel-Palestine. And Corbyn is significantly to the left of Bernie Sanders.
And foreign interventionism in general, Corbyn definitely is on a different plane.
Absolutely, but I think but there is still something that I think US voters, particularly progressives, can take from what's happening here. I think it is about defeating the establishment as a democratic party, because I think that's essentially what happened that got us in the point of having this election, was that people like me, people members of the Labour Party, took on and defeated the establishment of the Labour Party. Hillary didn't win here, Bernie won, and that meant that we could have an election which wasn't about tinkering with the system. You didn't have to say to people, all right, you're going to have to put your urge for civil rights and civil liberties and a better economic system and everything else on hold by voting Hillary in for another 4 to 8 years, because there is such a threat from Donald Trump, which was basically the prospect that was put towards progressives. And obviously many of them balked at that. And I do think it's been fairly toxic, actually, the way that I've seen people been described as Bernie bros and Green voters, this oh, you guys won Trump the election, all this kind of toxic nonsense.
The alt left is what they're now called, and they're denounced as as bomb throwers who, etc.
It's just absurd, and rather, that's the joke for me, is that instead of the establishment looking at Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump. Donald, this is who the Democratic Party lost against.
Yeah, and there are just huge systemic. There are huge systemic reasons that Trump won that indict the entire political class, including the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the media establishment, economic establishment, even the foreign policy establishment to some extent. And yet the blame or the culpability for his rise gets immediately displaced onto these pretty marginal elements, like people who were maybe strident Bernie Sanders supporters who didn't want to acquiesce to another kind of corrupt offering from the establishment Democratic Party, as if that is where the locus of the blame resides, rather than these massive forces which kind of collectively conspire to enable Trump to run in the first place.
And the thing is, of course, for them, it has to. It's like, of course, they have to do that. Because if they admit that they lost on their own merits, they lost because they failed to offer hope, inspiration, and a clear plan to the millions and tens of millions of Americans who really need it right now, they failed to do that, they would have to change. And they don't want to change. You've got people like Hillary who've been waiting in the wings for decades, being like, no, it's my time. It's my time. I've earned this. And, with scant regard for what the consequences would be on the electorate. And that delivered Trump. The Democratic establishment is responsible for, as much as anyone, for the rise of Donald Trump.
And the lack of desire to change, I think, is a very common human impulse, especially when you have an institution to protect. And if changing admits failure, and then it weakens the credibility of the institution that you're personally invested in. So you wouldn't expect them to just voluntarily admit failure. They have to be forced into it. And I think the same would have been said for the Labour Party establishment, until they were literally forced by kind of an insurgent uprising to change in the form of getting a leader that comes from a totally different segment of the political landscape in Corbyn.
Absolutely. And, for Labour, that did take losing 2 elections. So it was just one election. They had to lose in 2010, and then they had to lose in 2015. And even then, they were still saying, no, we got this. We got this. If we just keep doing the same thing for a third time's the charm, it's going to work. While all of us were saying they could have won in 2015. They really could have won in 2015 if they'd have actually changed and presented a viable alternative to austerity. They could have done it. And actually, I think we'd be walking this election too, incidentally, if the Labour Party had got behind Jeremy Corbyn when he became leader, if the likes of The Guardian and the New Statesman, who's supposed to be, liberal left-wing outlets had got behind Jeremy Corbyn when he became leader, I think we'd be looking at a Labour landslide now. We wouldn't be talking about maybe they're going to be a hung parliament, anything like that. I think we would have, rather than the 6 weeks that have taken place, you'd have had 18 months of what has happened in 6 weeks. And we wouldn't even be discussing who was going to be winning the election. It would have been a landslide for Labour. Do they have enough time now to do that? Possibly. But I think certainly for a US audience watching, I think you guys absolutely need to take it to the Democratic Party with everything you've got and make sure that when they're going up, the primaries that are, going to come next, make sure that you've got someone on that ticket who is going to be able to appeal to people who are struggling, as well as people who are, quote unquote, winning. Because the winners are a significantly smaller constituency than the losers in our economic system right now. And I think that we need to be supporting the candidates who do that. And I think that adds, I think, an additional responsibility on us all, actually, as voters, as critical thinkers, when we're reading media reports, is not to be missold. It's so difficult when all of the sort of respected voices of punditry are telling you day in and day out what you're asking for is impossible. You will be defeated miserably if you even attempt, what you're trying to do. You're an echo chamber. You don't represent the interests of the wider country. You're a marginal fringe constituency. You're being told that over and over every day. It's very difficult not to believe it, and eventually people did. And say what you like about the alt-right in America, they didn't believe it. They stood and fought for their candidate, and they got a president. And these are people that I have nothing in common with. They're it's like the worst of humanity as far as I'm concerned. And they managed to win because they defied the odds. They said, no, we just sod the lot of you. We're backing our candidate. And I think if progressives did that, they would win too. And that would not just be a win for their candidate. It would be a win for America, and it would be a win for the world, because you would then have a candidate who was going to take care of American citizens, but was also going to act as a responsible citizen on the world stage.
And I think one if there is a lesson that's transferable, between the U.S. and the UK, it's just that political outcomes, which were initially denigrated as 100% implausible by the established interests, they can become very much plausible in a almost a spellbindingly short period of time. I think part of that has to do with the technological changes, which enable people to pursue information on their own, and maybe there are some, there's a whole confluence of reasons for that. I'm sure we have to be, get into kind of a theoretical dialogue that could last several hours to get to the bottom of why that might be. But I think it is true, and I think people shouldn't be hamstrung by admonitions from people in power who are saying that their visions can't be achieved. I mean, and that would apply on the left and right. I mean, for better or for worse.
Absolutely.
Just in terms of now putting on my really banal punditry hat. I mean, as we end this conversation, in 2015, just prior to the election, there was talk of a hung parliament based on the polling. I mean, it seemed like Labour and Miliband were actually in a decent position to win if you judge from the polling. I don't know how true that ever was, but at the same time, the trajectory now in the polling data looks very good for Corbyn. There was a poll that came out just yesterday which showed Labour 1 point behind the Conservative Party, which is just a massive shift. And I think if Theresa May had ever envisioned that even being a possibility, she probably would not have called the election. So it seems like it's approaching the margin of error at this point, which means, given polling error in across countries in recent years, I think it's pretty much anybody's guess as to what will happen.
Yeah, the truth is, no one knows. That's the truth. Lots of people are trying to speculate. Nobody knows. Our pollsters got the Brexit vote wrong. That was apparently going to be a Remain vote. It was a Brexit vote. Obviously in the States, Donald Trump was going to lose. Not only was he going to lose, he was going to lose worse than anybody ever lost. And And, you know, he won. He didn't win the popular vote, but, you know, he won where it mattered in the US electoral system. And, you know, this is not a rerun of 2015. Obviously, 2015, we also have an election expenses scandal, which may or may not have impacted that very marginal result that we had in favour of the Conservatives. And we also had, you know, a Labour leader who was really unpopular. You know, kind of Edmund O'Bannon, zero charisma. There was no movement. There was no Labour movement ahead of that. The party was kind of barely any members left. You know, kind of reduced in membership, and it was kind of, you know, will he just limp over the line and secure a defeat with the Conservatives? But a lot of the Labour vote stayed home. They just or they went to the Liberal Democrats, or they went to UKIP. Actually, a lot of people, so about 4 million votes that went from Labour to UKIP, which are kind of a right-wing party, kind of our version of the Tea Party. So, you know, those were the dynamics in 2015. You know, 2 years later, it's a totally different landscape, because you've got Theresa May with a horrific campaign, which has brassed everybody off. You've got this incredible momentum behind the Corbyn campaign, and a genuine choice, which I think is going to have an impact in terms of turnout, because often people stay home if they're like, well, you know, there's like 6 inches between these people. It's not going to make a huge difference to me. Well, now, if Corbyn wins, we're talking about university tuition fees being scrapped, you know, for students. So you're talking about, you know, in a person's individual life, if they're 18 now, or between 18 and 25, wanting to go to university, talking about the difference between having £50,000 of debt and none, having it free. Massive, you know, life difference. You've got a difference in terms of NHS funding, which is a life and death issue to people in the United Kingdom. We've just had 3 terror attacks in 3 months, in part because Theresa May's government has cut 20,000 police officers from our streets. You know, you've got a Labour Party who's talking about bringing those police officers back. So really, a lot of high stakes issues with clear choices. That you vote one way, the world is going to look dramatically different from June the 9th forward than it will if you vote this way. So the sort of hope, I think, amongst those of us who want change, who want Theresa May to be packing her bags come dawn on June the 9th, is that we should get a serious turnout at this general election across the age groups and across ethnicities. And that could deliver a surprise. But we'll wait. We'll have to wait.
We shall see. And I guess we will leave it there for now. Thank you very much, Kerry-anne.
Thank you for having me on.
Bye.
Bye.